Good evening. Welcome to my second video of my history videos. I'm quite glad my first video has picked up and done well. This one will be over the well-known Vietnam era early MBT, main battle tank, M48 Patton III. I will just say M48 as that is the proper designation of this tank. Starting off, the M48 is the third in the line to be designated the Patton. The first two being the M46 Patton I and the M47 Patton II. It is 1953, and a new directive comes from the Ordnance Technical Committee Minutes, OTCM, number 3379-1. The directive was put forward and told tank designers and manufacturers that the T-48 90mm gun was the way of the future for new tank projects. Come time during 1952, the design elements of what would become the M48 were practically solidified. The frontal armor would no longer have a ball-mounted MG. It would use sloped armor on the upper and lower plates, and a hemispherical turret, though a little more oblong compared to the proper circular and hemispherical turrets of the T-54 and T-55 Soviet tanks. As well, on the drawing board were new and revolutionary ideas, but a few were redesigned, such as the idlers, sprockets, return rollers, the T-48 90mm, and the rangefinders. The internals of the project would go on. The internals of the project would go back to a four-man crew, since there was no longer a need for the main frontal plate to use a .30 caliber MG, as seen on the previous Pattons, and before them, the Pershings. In the year of 1953, after two small-scale models were built and the test T-48 tank was built, the OTCM would approve for production on the 2nd of April, 1953, for the standardization that would be the M48. 12,000 units would be built, lasting from 1952 to 1959. The M48 would go on to start life after the directive as a development off the stopgap M47. Now, to explain a little of the M47, it was the combination of the M46 chassis and the T-42 prototype. Seen in the images, the chassis was directly taken, while the T-42's turret design would be used and added to for the M47 Patton II. The M48 itself was made not long after the M47, and was quickly pressed into service in 1953. Once the production picked up and the M48 was seen as a better alternative, the U.S. Army and Marines would quickly come to adopt the tank. The M48 was something new entirely, adopting a new turret and chassis design. Well, it also bolstered a new suspension and much more powerful engine. Many other improvements were added to the M48 as well, making it superior compared to the previous M47. Getting into the design aspects, the whole would be significantly improved from the M47, as they used reports from the field about the T-54 and T-55's main gun and how it would penetrate front armor. From these reports, they would raise the frontal armor from 100mm to 110mm. The frontal plate had a redesign, where the frontal beak glacis was 53 to 60 degrees in slope and ranging from 110 to 6.5mm of armor. The plate above the driver is 57mm of armor, while the bottom armor, being the absolute bottom of the tank, would be 38mm to help with mine attacks. Side armor on the M48 uses 50 to 76mm of armor to a 30 to 44 degree angle, and only 25 to 35mm of armor with a 30 to 60 degree slope for the rear plate, which would be the back of the tank. Something to note, you won't find it with many other tanks other than the M48. It had a revolutionary design for the side armor. The side armor sloped in order to help with deflecting mine attacks, thus lessening the blast and destruction to the tank and saving the crew. I also want to preface Because of the sources I used, I do not know the validity of this, and I do not know where to back it up. As far as I remember being told, the side of slanted armor was to help with the lessening of mine attacks. Now, back to the hull construction. It was quite different from its predecessors. The previous Patton had a frontal plate that was flatter, while the M48 had a frog-like frontal plate that was completely sloped, as mentioned prior, with the armor thicknesses. Pads worked quite close with infantry, providing fire support and even letting infantry climb aboard and ride them onto the battlefield. Because of infantry sticking around the armor, the M48s are fitted with small boxes at the back of the tank that had a phone and a red light. This box would be used by the infantry to communicate with the tank commander directly. The red light was there, as if it were to light up, it meant the commander was trying to communicate with the infantry. Many tanks up till the 90s used this design of the phone on the back, if the tank was going to be directly with infantry. Abrams to this day still use it, now nicknamed the grunt phone. Tank phones can even be found on the late Shermans that were used in Korea, as the idea of the tank phone was implemented on the Shermans during the Korean War and was carried on into the Vietnam War with the M48. To also note here, many other tanks than just the Abrams, including French tanks, German tanks like the Leopard, British tanks, use tank phones to this day. Turret construction was quite different on the M48 compared to older tanks like the Pershing. It was built to be a lower profile, and because of how the weight was distributed throughout the turret ring, the center of gravity was practically on the turret ring. This lower down and very centered gravity gave the tank, and especially the turret, a lot of stability. The rear of the turret was completely rounded with a reduced shot trap. How it was made was through a way of casting. Early Shermans are well known for their cast hulls, and the M48 was no stranger to being built fully out of cast homogeneous steel. The frontal armor on the turret is 180 millimeters to give the crew maximum survivability, and right behind that was the rangefinder. Rangefinders were changed over the years, and to be more on the side of the turret to give better view of the field. And the M48 was given the stereoscopic T46 A1 rangefinder, as it was the best of the time. The armor on the rest of the turret was still quite nice, as it was given 76 millimeters of armor on the sides of the turret, 50 millimeters on the rear of the turret, and 25 millimeters on the top of the turret. The gun shield, or mantlet, was given 110 millimeters of armor, and was flat compared to the pig snout M47 mantlet. The commander cupola was quite unique on the M48 as well, since it was given full traversal like a normal tank turret, but it was given a 50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun. Because of the commander cupola being exposed, it would be replaced with a fully enclosed commander cupola on some of the later M48A variants. The M48 was given the 90mm M41 with the M47 mount. In earlier versions, it had a Y-shaped fume extractor that would be later redesigned into a T-shaped fume extractor. But the gun was the traversal units. They were 360-degree electric hydraulic units that gave it 24 degrees a second in traversal speed. Additionally, with how the turret was made, the traversal on the gun would give it a 19-degree elevation and a 9-degree depression statistic. Just as important as the main gun was the coaxial machine gun. The machine gun was a 30 caliber M1919 A4 E1 that had almost 6,000 rounds to burn through. Now we're down into the dirty section of the tank, and also the absolute most important part of the tank, the engine and drivetrain. Specifically, the M48 was given an upgraded engine from the M47, a Continental AV 1790 5B 7B 7C V12. Now, the 7 series I had there is more than likely just a different, later modified variant of the Continental engine. Earlier versions of the M48, up to the M48 A2C, would also use an auxiliary engine, lovingly nicknamed Little Joe. This little man would pack a punch consisting of what is shown on screen. I'll be real, I know friends who love engines and would understand this, but I barely have a clue about some of these things outside the horsepower, RPM, and the torque and foot per pound or foot-pound. If the engine was hit, and the hydraulic line was ruptured, it could easily be engulfed in a fireball. From this, the dual engine was deemed unreliable and removed, replaced with a single engine. To access the engine, you'd have to open up large vent panels on the engine deck. Behind them were the transmission hatches. And additionally, the transmission was a General Motors CD 850 4A or A4B with one reverse and two forward ranges. There were filter hatches and also rear vents, which were used for the exhaust. The whole of the tank wasn't treated, but it was waterproof. Thus, it gave the tank a river fording capacity of 48 inches. Undoubtedly, the tank performance was the most important part of the tank, as it had a top speed on the road of 28 miles per hour. It doesn't seem like much, but for the time, it was a good speed and didn't need much more. As usual, tanks would have to encounter slopes, and the M48 could take on a 22-degree or 40% slope with a max grade of 60%, which is 30 degrees. The M48 was given neutral turning and could even cross a 102-inch wide trench gap. After the big talk about engines, you and I both probably want to hear and know more about the production history and some of the variants. Well, here you go. Historically, the factory count on the amount of units produced is 11,703. Quite a few tanks, but it wasn't just one company. It was Ford Motor Company, Chrysler Corporations, and Fisher Tank Arsenal, who would produce the M48. This would include all versions of the M48, so 11,703 M48s were a mix of many types. During the production of the whole, the driver's hatch was given an infrared optic, or as most people know and call it, heat vision. This optic would help the driver to see enemies a lot easier when he needed to the most. Sadly, the first 100 M48s were rejected due to incorrect ballistic protection. Thus, they ended up being used only as M48 training units. Though, these 100 would later be designated as the M48C variant. In order to help with the lack of range, the M48 was given 4 external jettisonable fuel tanks, usually held on their own rack, as seen on image. These 4 drums alone would help to give the M48s an extended range of 135 miles. This concludes the main portion of the tank's development and brief history. Now I'll go on to talk about the 5 variants I have information about. And to note, going off script here, I do not have it listed, but there is the M48 A4. It more than likely does not have much on it, or my sources just did not have it listed because it wasn't significant. Starting off with the M48 A1, of course, we have covered this one a bit earlier on, with it being the first production variant. It had a lot of the main features originally put forward for the tank, nothing too special. Next is the M48 A2, which was accepted in 1956 and had an improved fuel injection version of the Continental engine and new transmission. The M48 A2 would see redesign of the rear plate exhaust louvers and side intakes, which was overtop the main exhaust tunnel. Thus, it greatly improved the tank's engine efficiency and capacity of the engine bay. This more compact design allowed the tank to have bigger fuel tanks inside, upping it to 335 gallons held within the M48's fuel tanks, and giving the M48 160 miles. The M48 A2 has improved turret control for the gunner, and relocated the engine's air filters for easier access to the engine bay, and better maintenance access too. The suspension would also be modified, fitting a compensating idler attachment, a double bump spring on the first road wheel arm, and friction snubbers instead of hydraulic shock absorbers. Along the side of the tank, in the track layout, the second and fourth return rollers were completely removed, though no other M48 would have this after the standard A2 model. For the main compartment, the driver was given a larger steering wheel, and the shifter was relocated to the floor on the driver's right side. A good feature was added for the crew of the... my goodness, what am I doing? A good feature was added for the crew of the M48 A2. This was the personnel heater exhaust pipe, allowing the exhaust to flow through the pipe and heat up the air in the crew cabin, given to it by the M48 A3, which we'll cover that in a bit. A small detail as well is that the fenders were flattened. 2,328 of the M48 A2s were produced. Also, the M48 A2C variant would have further modifications. It would go on to have the older telescopic rangefinder replaced with a more user-friendly M17 coincidence rangefinder. This new rangefinder also had a computer attached to it, which would integrate temperature data and could be shifted into all metric measurements for the export variants. The track layout would be changed again to have the rear auxiliary tension wheels removed from the design completely. On to the third version, the M48 A3. It experienced another engine overhaul, with the M48 A2s having issues with the gasoline engines. It would go on to get a new engine upgrade in 1963. This would also be carried out and put onto the A1 and A2 models. The conversion of the gasoline engines on the M48 A1 and A2 models were done by the Anniston Army Depot and Red River Army Depot. As usual, the turret would also receive love and would get to see the rangefinder upgraded from the stereoscopic rangefinder to the M17 A1 standard. The driver would also receive a new M24 infrared sight, and the main gun also got upgraded to the M87 A1 mount. The Continental AVDS 1792 V12 air-cooled twin-turbo diesel was fitted to the M48 A3 by fitting the M60 grills and exhaust louvers to the tank, as well as dry air cleaners instead of the oil bath system, which was very prone to catching on fire. The older auxiliary engine idea was omitted due to the better engine that was placed into the tank. The M48 A3 would receive the standardized personnel heater pipe, and this would be carried over to the M48 A2 and the M60 models respectively. Better fire extinguishers were given to the tank, but that is pretty much overshadowed by the fact that the gun has a huge IR searchlight, or sometimes it would be a xenon white light. By the year of 1967, Bowen McLaughlin York Incorporated started producing the Mod B. You may wonder, what is the M48 A3 Mod B? Well, it was given modified armor framing, some armor around the taillights, and a distinctive raised-up commander cupola consisting of an adapter ring and all-around vision blocks. Fuel lines were relocated for safety, and the driver would be given better controls and gauges from the M60 A1 model of Patton. Not to mention, knockout hulls for the torsion bar system, modified mudguards above the return rollers, detachable headlights, detachable raised-up telephone intercom, and IR fire control for the gunner. So now the gunner can see his enemies without needing any sort of light. He can just tell by heat. In the early years of 1968 and into the 1970s, the M48 A3 would receive the excellent diesel engine, the AVDS 1790 2C or 2D. This engine was also put into the retrofitted M47 Patton, the M48 A1, the British Centurion, and French AMX-30, among other tanks. Capping this off for the M48 A3, once the Mod B was rolled out for all the M48 A3s, the distinction of Mod B was abandoned. That was a lot, but the M48 A5 has a little less than the A3 variant. The M48 A5 was the last upgrade, and the most major one for the M48 line. The firepower of the M48 was increased by bumping it up to the standards of the newer M60 Patton. This gun modification was accepted in October of 1975 and applied to the remaining 2,069 M48s from many variants, including the A3 by the Anniston Army Depot. The fitting of the M68 105mm gun was carried out by borrowing many other parts from the M60 Patton series, which was helped by the commonality of the M48 A5 and M60 Patton. Additionally, the M48 A5 would get the Continental AVDS 1790 2D, bolstering 385 gallons and really improving the mileage to 300 miles of range. Again, the M1 cupola was changed, but this time it received the Israeli-designated Radon model in August of 1976. What sets this cupola apart, as seen, was that it was much more shallow, opened vertically, and had 3 periscopes instead of the all-around vision blocks the earlier models of the M48 are generally known for. With the changing of times and newer M60 machine gun being much more prevalent on the field, the inner coax was changed out from the M1919 30 count to the M60 machine gun. Going back now to the engine, it was replaced again with the AVDS 1790 Red Seal model, rated at 750 horsepower in the 1980s, and then to the Gold Medallion engine in the 1990s on the M48 A5 E1. The characterization of the M48 A5 E1 was the adoption of a full-resolution digital fire control system, a laser range finder, and an improved day-night sight assembly. This is where the main M48 variants end. A few others that are notable are the Genies, which were M48 A2s and M48 A5 variants. The M48 A2 AVLB, which had a scissor-style bridge, while the A5 AVLB was the same bridge, though it was lengthened to 60 feet. A real gem version that has to be mentioned is the M67 Zippo, which was the flamethrower M48. It was originally designed for the Marine Corps, but would see use by both the Army and Marines. The M7 projector, the flamethrower, was fitted within a fake barrel that also had a muzzle brake, thus giving it the impression that it was a normal M48. Though instead of a 90mm tank round, if you were facing it, you'd be quickly hit with flaming gasoline, which could be fired out of the gun to 490 feet. Because of how dense the jungles were in Vietnam, and how effective walls of fire were in this terrain, as seen with the Zippo Shermans in Okinawa, the M67 Zippo was widely used in Vietnam. I thank you so much for listening. If you have come this far, I genuinely thank you personally. It means a lot, honestly. I really do implore you check out my first video about a rare World War II German project. Outside that, I also implore you to check out the websites listed for the information, images, and even listed experiences in other countries. There's so much more to this tank I may not have covered, and you really should go looking for it if I have not covered it, and if you are interested. As a side note, on my personal connection, My grandfather served in Vietnam and took a photograph of a version of an engineering M60 Patton known as the M728. There are so many versions of the M48 and mainly versions of the M60 Patton from other countries I did not cover, so please, go check out the sites and go searching if you are interested. Again, thank you so much, and if you have enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so you can get more of it, and so I know that you've enjoyed the video. Leave a comment, and whatever I did or did not get wrong, correct me if I did get something wrong, especially like the Erdan model of the tank cupola. I know I'm saying that wrong. If you know how to say it right, I would love to know. If you have experiences with this tank in your family or have seen them, tell me. It'd be awesome. Thank you so much again. Have a great one.